The other thing we've got, the third big thing for us this year is what's called the PARC. It's a Partnership Agreement on Relations and Cooperation. It was signed last September at Foreign Minister level, and that's a treaty level agreement that basically deals with the rest of the relationship. Everything that's not trade is in there. And the PARC will have under it an annual officials-led dialogue where we'll talk about the various elements of the relationship, additional to those very specific dialogues we have at the moment. And we'll have that as a vehicle for taking on the table at this point to put under the PARC umbrella, but we'll get to that conversation when we have the first meeting, probably around the middle of this year. That's been signed, it's got to go through an EU ratification process, and I'll just mention that briefly because it relates to FTAs and things as well. Basically in Europe, if you sign something, they can have a provisional application arrangement that goes alongside it, which means that they will provisionally apply all of the elements until such time as the various states have ratified. You're only fully bound by a treaty when all of the states have ratified it. In Europe, because they've got 34 different parliaments across the 28 member states, Belgium has 7, it can take up to 5 years to get through this process. So provisional application is really important, and then you have ratification that dribbles on for a long time afterwards. So for us, provisional application of the PARC, and hopefully in due course the FTA, are really important elements of our engagement with them. So that's New Zealand. Finally, a few words on Brexit. You all know the story. The British people voted by a very narrow margin in June last year to leave the European Union. That was the first time that anyone's decided to leave. It was a huge shock for the EU. Underneath pretty polite words, there was a lot of anger, and that anger still subsists. There was a sense that it was done largely for domestic political reasons in the UK, and that the challenges involved were massive, and the loss that the departure of the UK would represent from Europe was really something that the Europeans find a bit of a pill to swallow. The world's moved on a bit. I think people have got used to the idea. Prime Minister May has made it clear where she's trying to go. She said that she'll trigger Article 50, which is the formal mechanism for saying we want to leave. She's mentioned 9 March, but by the end of March she's also mentioned, so we'll see if that happens. The early March timing is quite important because the European Union have their 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome in mid-March, so anything that was triggered around that time would take the bloom away from that particular party. So we'll see what happens there. Once she triggers it, the EU's got to come back to the UK and tell them what the process will be, what the rules of the game will be, and that'll take them a few weeks, and then they'll get into negotiations and run forward from there. Elections come into this too, because France's second round presidential election is on May the 6th, so they won't want to do anything much before that, and the risk of running it into the process. And Germany's got elections later in the year too. I don't think that'll be such a concern, but they'll be conscious of those sort of internal EU things in terms of how they go about negotiating. It's going to be a very difficult negotiation because it'll affect every area of the relationship between the EU and the UK. There is something like 21,000 pieces of EU law or regulation that need to be reviewed, and a similar number obviously in the UK. The former British permanent representative to Brussels said to me that he thought that it would take 2 terms of the British Parliament to work through all of the legal bits and pieces of the divorce. Which is a pretty huge amount of work that needs to be done. They've got 2 years to conclude the negotiation from when they start. The period can be extended by mutual agreement, but the indications from the European side have been that they don't really want to extend more than a short period if absolutely necessary to sort of tidy things up. So the 2 years is pretty much a hard deadline. And Michel Barnier, who's the Frenchman who's going to be leading the negotiations for the European side, has said in practice he thinks there'll be about 15 months negotiation from when the thing's triggered, because they need the last few months on the European side to sort of get the approvals and things they need from the European Parliament, and that's not a given, so they need some serious time to do all of that. So it's going to be a very high stakes game. The first part of the negotiation will be about the exit. How do you manage the divorce? The second part will be about the future relationship, which will turn out to be some kind of new trade and economic relationship, and there'll be some provisions around transition. There'll be provisions around financial aspects. There's been a lot of speculation in the last few days that one of the first subjects is going to be the financial aspects, and €68 billion is one of the figures that's been mentioned. Other figures take it up as high as €138 billion as the cost for the UK of leaving. Now that's going to be politically very hard because of the way that money was played in the British context rather during the debate. On the question of the process, the Europeans have already got in place some very skilled teams thinking about every single area of the relationship and how they're going to go through the negotiation. And the Brits will have been doing exactly the same thing. So I think what you'll find pretty quickly is that they'll break up into negotiating teams as you do a free trade agreement, for example, and they'll be working through these different areas. And how that all comes back together at the end of the process is something that we've got to wait and see. There's been a lot of talk about what sort of economic relationship the EU and the UK might have at the end of the day. Obviously at the moment they've got a totally open, or nearly totally open, trade and economic relationship, free movement of people, free movement of goods and services, all that kind of thing. The Europeans have been saying that it's important to make sure that they don't cherry pick and just get a sweetheart deal out of this, because if they do, that will be attractive for other European Union members perhaps to try and follow suit. So what they've got to do is come up with some kind of package which takes away from the current ceiling, if you like, the current arrangement they've got, which gives the Brits a very good level of access to Europe, but is sufficiently reduced so that it's not a point of attraction for other member states. So I think the reality is that you'll have the current arrangement as your ceiling, and the floor will be something like the Canada Free Trade Agreement, and they've got to figure out what between the two has to be removed in order for the relationship to work. And that's going to be quite interesting and quite tricky for them to work through. On the European side, you don't have common interests across the 28. You've got countries like Ireland, which don't want to see anything change because they've got such a close people-to-people and economic relationship with the UK. You've got other countries like Bulgaria and Romania, Poland, whose main interest is ensuring that the people, their people who are living in the UK, still have right to work and live and all that kind of stuff. So you've got those sort of two contrasts, and then you've got others in between with a mix of interests. I think it's going to be extremely difficult. Can't predict where it's going to come out. It could get very bad very quickly if the politics on either side don't work, and I think both sides are conscious of that. Both sides say they want to have the best possible future relationship, and I think they're genuine about wanting that, but whether the politics will allow it, given the way that media in particular sort of pick up on different things, will be really interesting to see. This all impacts on our relationships with Europe, because we have, through the WTO, guaranteed economic access to the European Union, including in such sensitive areas as lamb and butter. And there's a TRQ, is the technical word for it, that we have for this access. And at some point, the EU and the UK and us will have to negotiate what the future of that TRQ will be in a sort of post-Brexit environment. And they've got that problem with many other WTO members as well. What we've said to them is, we don't want to be any worse off than we are now. These are really important to us. These are not a two-way negotiation where Europe and the UK talk and then tell us what the answer is. These are a three-way negotiation where the three of us sit and talk at an early stage and work this through so that we come up with the right kind of outcome. And to this point, both the Europeans and the UK have said, yes, we agree. So at some point, alongside all this other work that is going on, there'll have to be that conversation with us, and there'll be similar conversations with a whole range of other countries as well on that front. And that's going to be difficult and challenging too. You'll have seen that there's been speculation about a free trade agreement between the UK and New Zealand, and our position on that has been very clear. The Prime Minister made it clear when he came to Brussels and to London and to Berlin, where he said our first trade policy priority is to get an FTA with Europe. It's been something we're working for a long time, or we're close to getting there. And we recognise that the UK does not have the legal authority to negotiate yet. Until it has exited, it is still a member of the EU, and all of the rules around the EU apply to it, so they're still in. But he said, and we've said, at the point the UK is able to do something, sure, we'd love to. And for the moment, what we've been doing with the UK is telling them how we do trade policy, telling them how we set ourselves up, sharing information about the FTAs that we've done, And at some point, when it's possible, obviously we'll go further than that, but that's not right now. There are other things that will flow too for us in terms of the discussion with the UK afterwards. I mean, our ministers have talked to them about people movement, because our people access to the UK has diminished over the years, and that'll be important to try and resolve too. I would note on the FTA front, though, that the UK is within the EU until such time as it leaves. So assuming we start negotiations this year, the UK will be sitting at the table and participating in those negotiations. So there's a possibility, depending on all the time frames and everything else, that we might get the conclusion of an EU-28 agreement before the UK has formally left. David Davis, one of the senior UK ministers, said the other day that for those FTAs that the UK already has, they'd just like to try and find a way to roll those over. So that's a possibility too, but it's early days. There's a whole lot of work to be done between now and then. So I'll stop